This is a world directory of the radical right published in Great Britain. It has an entry in here on the National Alliance and on me.
These ideas and these actions that he wrote about were direct fantasies about things that he wished he could do in America.
My books, my writing generally has had more influence perhaps on the thinking of the white resistance in this country.
The book is called The Turner Diaries. In it, the FBI building in Washington is blown up by white supremacists. It may have been a blueprint for what happened in Oklahoma City.
Did your father know Timothy McVeigh?
Yes.
There's the Alfred Murray Federal Building behind me, and you can see just how badly damaged it is. It's about half of the building that is literally hanging, and at the bottom two floors are just stacked debris.
You know, when he lived in Washington, D.C., he truly had fantasies that he could go out at night by himself with a gun, and he could see interracial couples and he could murder them.
All right, we're joined today by Kelvin Pierce. And Kelvin, you have written a book about your father, who passed away, I believe, in 2001 or thereabouts, William Luther Pierce. And Dr. Pierce is a well-known figure, and I guess I'll just say the fringe right. But how are you doing today, Kelvin?
I'm doing well. It's good to be with you, Eric.
Well, it's good to be with you. And I, at a brief glance, saw your father was a pretty talented and a very well-educated scientist, which would probably surprise a lot of people. It appears that you have a little bit of that in your background too. I thought I saw there was some aeronautical training and things like that. Are you also into science and engineering?
Yeah, I mean, my dad was definitely way smarter than me. He was a PhD scientist, and he got his PhD in physics. At his time when he earned his PhD, he was a world-renowned scientist. There were scientists all over the world that reached out to him about his research work. He did a lot of research work about absolute zero um, temperature research. Um, I personally did my education in aerospace engineering. I earned a degree in aerospace and ocean engineering from Virginia Tech, and I pursued that degree to a certain degree. But as far as I'm concerned, my dad was leagues ahead of me when it comes to his intelligence and his capability of learning and experience.
Okay, and I wanted to start with that because I always want to acknowledge um, success or skills or things like that. Now, with your dad, it's a very interesting case because he was by all factors brilliant, but yet he had, I guess I would say, a virulent hatred, it appears, of people who were not like him. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, that would be perfectly fair. I mean, when he was at the University of Colorado earning his advanced degree, when he started, he was a perfectly normal person. But during that tenure while he was there, something happened, and I can't describe exactly what happened, but he started doing a lot of research and reading. Um, but he changed. He became a normal, carefree person into a completely hate-filled person. Um, but at the same time, he was brilliant. I mean, he certainly was a brilliant scientist. Um, he earned his degree as a PhD in physics. There's no disputing that, but at the same time, he became a completely hate-filled person and decided to dedicate the rest of his life to hate. And I can't explain why that happened or how that happened, but that's exactly what happened.
I find that fascinating, and especially because, what your dad did, with scientific thinking obviously involved a lot of rigorous study and testing things and really getting counter sources and things of that sort. But it appears when it came to the political side, he really went down a path, and doesn't seem like he researched alternatives very much. Or
No, I mean, when it first started, he was at the Oregon State University. And I think that was the first time that he really experienced liberal values in his life. And Oregon State at that time was very liberal, and it was accepting of, interracial relationships and things like that. I think it was the first time in his life that he experienced a true interrelationship relationship. You know, he, he talked about having a very friendly relationship with a new professor that was at his level, but then he experienced that um, professor had a interracial marriage and interracial couples, and he talked about how that affected him and how he felt like that was wrong. And at the same time, he was also doing a lot of reading. He was starting to take attention to the civil rights movement that was happening in America. He was starting to pay attention to the Vietnam War protests that were happening in America. He was really starting to pay attention to politically what was happening within our government. He was also reading, about European history and about the Bolshevik Revolution and about what he considered was Jewish influence in world politics. And all of that started shaping his beliefs. And it completely changed him as a human being.
yeah, now as he was reading, he kind of was very impressed with one particular figure and wound up starting a relationship with him. That was George Lincoln Rockwell. Um, can you talk about how that developed?
I mean, when he first experienced Rockwell was when he saw Rockwell being interviewed on TV. Um, he saw a TV interview with Rockwell, um, and I mean, the best way to experience is that he agreed with Rockwell's views when Rockwell answered questions. And so what he decided to do was um, to travel from Oregon State University, which is on the west coast of America, to Arlington, Virginia, to visit with Rockwell and to basically have a personal conversation with him and decide, is this somebody that I agree with?
The communists are doing to my country just what they did to Germany in the 20s. Exactly the same inflation, the same insanity, the same destruction of law and order, the same inflation is almost here, the same riots, the same bedlam, and the same Jews operating it. Even the same Jews. Most of them are over here running the civil rights movement. Same people.
He told my mother at the time that he was going to a physics conference, which was a total lie. But instead, what he did was he traveled to the eastern United States and had a personal conversation with Rockwell and decided that he and Rockwell both agreed that they needed to solve this so-called Jewish scheme that was happening in the world. And after he returned from this conference with Rockwell, he quit his job as a professor at Oregon State University. And he basically told my mom was, hey, I'm going to move to the East Coast and you can come with me or not. I don't care. And my mom she was so afraid. She was like, I have twin 2-year-old boys, and what am I going to do? how am I going to manage this on my own? So she decided to come with him. And, that was probably the biggest mistake of her life.
Wow. So you were only 2 at the time. This
Two.
is
Yeah, I was two.
so you didn't really get a chance to experience the fun-loving father you described in your living memory.
No, that does not exist because at the time I was two, um, you know, my brother and I, who are twins, we were experiencing what we call potty training.
Mm.
Um, and whenever I made a mistake in potty training, my father's response was to beat me. That was my first experience at being beaten by my father, and that just continued and intensified from there until I was probably 18 years old.
Wow. That is horrible. So to pivot back, so now he was with George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the founder of, I want to say, the American Nazi Party. I can't remember all the
No,
organization.
no, absolutely. It was called the American Nazi Party at that time.
Okay. And then he pivoted, and partly under your father's influence, from what I understand, to rename the organization to kind of tone it down a little bit, make it a little more mainstream. What did it become?
The National Socialist White People's Party.
Which isn't really that much better, but
No, my dad had a serious problem with the stormtrooper uniforms that Rockwell's people would wear. He didn't want it to be a a blue collar thing. He wanted it to be more like a white collar organization where professionals believed in transforming America. So he wanted it to be more of not a Nazi party, but more of a white people's party.
so to be fair, I mean, I think we'd all agree your dad was a racist, and a severe
Yeah.
anti-Semite. Sounds like he was also a classist, if that would be the right term too. Like he um appreciate upper class, like he separated the lower class, quote unquote, blue collar, whatnot, riffraff almost.
I mean, for him, it was really important to try to get white collar people involved in the movement. I mean, his biggest complaint while he was leader of the National Alliance was, I can't get people who are middle class Americans who are comfortable with having a home and two cars and a comfortable toilet. I can't get them comfortable with rebelling against, um, the racist issue that he was trying um, to promote. He was like that these people are too comfortable and they're not willing to put their necks out on the line to do what it takes to change America. That was his biggest problem, is that most of the people that were willing to put their necks out on the line were just loser rednecks who had nothing to lose and who had nothing better to do than to dress up in Nazi uniforms and act like thugs in public. But most of his promoters, the closet people who would send him money, were not willing to put themselves out in public and say, hey, I'm a supporter of this, because they didn't want to lose their job. They didn't want to lose their standing in society. They didn't want to have a chance of losing all of the American perks that they had as middle class Americans.
I don't know if you have looked into the alternative at the time, which was, obviously the communists. And this goes back to World War II, the brown shirts versus the red shirts. So there's like competing philosophies. But ironically, communism had the same problem that your dad complained about, where they were saying, well, we can't get the workers to uprise because they're too darn comfortable with just what you described. And so ironically, they went also on the racial side, but with things like the Black Panthers, Black Power. Okay, so I find some of this to be very interesting that, to me, hate is hate, wherever it comes from, but it's almost a mirror, if you will.
Absolutely. I mean, forever, this was my father's biggest complaint was like, middle class Americans are too comfortable. They're not willing to risk their middle class American life. They're not willing to risk their homes and their two cars and their job and their security. And there's no way they're going to put their necks out to really fight for white America. And that was his biggest complaint throughout history.
Well, now to pivot forward. Okay. George Lincoln Rockwell was ultimately assassinated, and it wasn't
1967. Yep.
right. It wasn't a political assassination. It was more of a conflict within his organization. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, it was totally interpersonal.
George Lincoln Rockwell, leader of the American Nazi Party, meets a violent end. Murdered by a sniper's bullet in a Virginia shopping center not far from his headquarters. Suburban Arlington is the scene of the shooting, and the sniper's perch was the roof of a coin-operated laundry. Rockwell's accused killer is a former member of his extremist group. Eyewitnesses said Rockwell slumped in his car after 2 shots crashed through the windshield.
And the person who did it really didn't suffer very badly for it because people didn't really care for George Lincoln Rockwell, it appears at the time. I think you wrote in your book that he got the minimum sentence possible for doing it and was even on probation in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, Halter, he got away with murder, completely. But when you look at and a global view, who did he murder? He murdered somebody that society looks at as a Nazi. And so, yeah, he got away with murder. Absolutely. And my dad and him personally clashed, monumentally. My dad and him had completely different views about how the American Nazi Party or the, white socialist People's Party should continue.
Just to clarify, your dad and George Lincoln Rockwell had conflicts in the view.
No, my dad and Palter had very personal conflicts about how things should pursue.
Okay. Whatever happened with Palter?
I mean, he eventually got out of jail, and then he basically, ended up back going into society and disappearing.
Okay, so he kind of left it all behind in a way.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. All right. So now, after Rockwell was killed, was assassinated, the organization fell under new leadership. I think your dad was in third third in line or something like that, or third place. I don't know how you'd put it. What happened then? Rockwell dies. Somebody takes over. There seemed to be some real conflicts. Like there was nobody to hold it together.
Yeah, I mean, after Rockwell died, there were a couple other people within the American Nazi Party who tried to seize control, and they tried to force my father out. And they were successful in doing that, and they basically seized all the money and created a false narrative about how my dad was being nefarious and trying to destroy the organization. But this is what happens when you have a bunch of how do you say it? You have a bunch of non-thinking people who are a part of an organization that have no ability to really think about the future. And so the few people who tried to seize control were able to control them. My father was able to, pretty quickly realize that this was a non-winning situation. So he exited the situation. But soon after, he formed his own organization, the National Alliance.
This is a world directory of the radical right published in Great Britain. It has an entry in here on the National Alliance and on me. And it says, Pierce is one of the senior figures of the American ultra-right.
That eventually became one of the most preeminent hate organizations in the world.
Now, to back up a little on that, the National Alliance, from my understanding, was actually to start the National Youth Alliance for George Wallace, former presidential candidate who got shot himself.
Yeah, George Wallace, he formed an organization after his presidential campaign. At first it was, George Wallace for president, but then he, uh, formed another organization, which basically was a youth alliance. And my father got involved with that. But it wasn't long. I mean, very quickly that my father and George Wallace became arch enemies because they didn't see eye to eye on how things would go. And my father and Wallace spent years, um, including people who worked with Wallace, um, fighting each other, and including personally and in courts, until finally my father was able to completely separate himself from that and form the National Alliance and become completely independent. And eventually, National Alliance was completely run and controlled by my father.
Okay, how centralized was National Alliance? Really, was it ideological cohesion or command and control? I mean, was it your dad? Period. Like, it was an organization, but it was really your dad. There was nothing else going on.
I mean, eventually, the National Alliance was completely my father. Um, and then, of course, with any kind of alliance or cult or whatever you want to call it, there were people that would attach themselves to this. But ultimately, the National Alliance was 100% William Luther Pierce. It had everything to do with his writings and had everything to do with his weekly radio podcasts, the American Dissident Voices. Had everything to do with his book, The Turner Diaries. Ultimately, the National Alliance was all about William Luther Pierce. Eventually, he took on other people to help him, and then he took on other arms, such as his music arm, which took on white nationalists or racist music and things like that.
You offhandedly said cult, and I just want to ask: would you consider your father a cult leader and National Alliance a cult?
Hmm. I mean, that's a good question, Eric. I'm not sure I totally understand what the definition of a cult is. So maybe I use that term loosely. I mean, what I would consider National Alliances truly is a hate group.
Mhm.
This is an organization that allows you to channel your hate toward the other. Um, it allows people who don't feel good about themselves to feel better about themselves, to align themselves with a group of people who have decided to hate another group of people. My dad's group decided that anything that was non-white was worthy of hate. Jewish people, non-whites, non-Northern Europeans, anybody who was threatening the supremacy of the white race in Northern America was subject to hate. And anybody who felt bad about themselves or who felt lost, they could join this group and feel better about themselves because they could choose another group of people to hate.
There was something I had read somewhere, I don't know if it's accurate or not, and it makes me wonder if there's a hierarchy of hatred. I do know that I've interviewed Jeff Scoop, who was the leader of another organization of that type, essentially American Nazi Party type of organization.
Okay.
And he mentioned that there were people in the organization. He is no longer in it. He's gotten out, but he had mentioned in that organization that some of them they were okay with black people, but when it came to anybody Jewish, that was just a bridge too far. It literally is like, and I'm asking that because I read somewhere that there was a sort of informal agreement or some sort of reaching out between your father and Louis Farrakhan at one point.
No,
No, there was not.
absolutely not, Eric.
Okay.
I can tell you 100% without a doubt, my father hated black people. I can't describe to you the derogatory terms that he used to describe black people. And when he saw black people on TV when I was very young, he made these most awful sounds. Um, the terms he used to describe black people was extremely derogatory. And the reason for this is that he considered blacks as an extreme threat to white people, because he felt like that mainstream media was controlled by Jewish people, and he felt like Jewish people were using mainstream media to introduce and encourage the mixing of white people with non-whites. So he felt like any TV show that was on America that showed a white person and a black person in a relationship, he felt like that was completely 100% Jewish control. And he was absolutely 100% against it. He hated black people because he felt like they were 100% a threat against against white people and the white race.
Wow. Pretty dark. Now, your father is probably most famous for, of course, the book, The Turner Diaries.
Yes.
And I want to get into that. But that's not his only book. He has another book called The Hunter.
My books, my writing generally has had more influence perhaps on the thinking of the white resistance in this country. The Turner Diaries certainly has gotten a lot of publicity, and I think it has had an effect on the thinking of many other people. I hope that my new book, Hunter, will have an effect on the thinking of a lot of people.
Yeah, as well. Just not nowhere nearly as well known as the
Yes.
Turner Diaries,
Yes.
or notorious. I don't know what you would want to call it. I mean, the Turner Diaries is well known. I guess I would say notorious versus famous, but incredibly influential. Did you ever talk to him about the book? I know he always claimed that it was fiction, but did he have higher ambitions for the book other than fiction? As in, was it a blueprint?
I mean, for him, he considered it a novel. He considered it fiction. And that was because he was incredibly aware about the laws in America. He was incredibly aware of what he could be exposed to about what he wrote. So he always stood by the stand that this is a novel and I don't mean anything by this. But I know him personally, and from my conversations with him, that these ideas and these actions that he wrote about were direct fantasies about things that he wished he could do in America.
Interesting, interesting. What your father wrote a lot before that. I mean, he wrote newsletters, he wrote for the organizations, and that would be all considered essentially nonfiction. What inspired your father to write out these fantasies, if you will, as fiction?
I mean, for him, his ultimate goal was to try to convince young people in America to change their view about the American government and to decide that enough was enough and decide that it was time to rise up and overthrow the U.S. government with a white nationalist revolution. That was his ultimate goal. His ultimate goal was to create a race war in America. And he felt like the only way to do that was to reach out to and convince young Americans, like college students, that, hey, if we don't do it now, it will never happen. Um, and, he had fantasies about, when he lived in Washington, D.C., he truly had fantasies that he could go out at night by himself with a gun and he could see interracial couples and he could murder them. And he had fantasies about, you know, congressmen who were advancing racial integration laws. And he had fantasies about how he could go out and murder them. That's what this book was all about.
So it would be fair to say that he created a weapon. That the book was more than just, hey, I want to be a New York Times bestseller. I want to tell this really cool story. He wanted to influence people directly, and he was targeting, as you put it, specifically young people, like some could say a young soldier who fought in the Gulf War, who ultimately created a bomb or drove a vehicle to a government building and blew up the building in a similar scenario to an incident that occurred in the book.
Welcome to CNN Presents. I'm Judy Woodruff. The book is called The Turner Diaries. In it, the FBI building in Washington is blown up by white supremacists. It may have been a blueprint for what happened in Oklahoma City.
I mean, when my dad started this, it was way before the Gulf War. I mean, way before. This was during the Vietnam War era.
Mhm.
So when my dad started this, his goal was to reach, the 1960s college student and say, hey, our government is totally fucked up. Our government is totally Zionist, and you need to realize this, and we need to make a change. But, when he wrote his monthly newspaper, which was called Attack, and it was distributed all over college campuses all over the United States, it really never had an impact. And he complained about this to one of his prominent supporters. And one of his prominent supporters told him, hey, you know what? You need to write something that really reaches these people. You need to write, a basic, simplistic novel. And my dad really took this to heart. And that's when he started the Turner Diaries. He started writing one chapter in each edition of this Attack magazine that came out every month. And over a few months, it became very popular. It became so popular to the point that my dad decided, you know what, I need to put all of these chapters into a book. And that's when he created the book. And then, the book kind of grew into what it is now. After the Turner Diaries were published, and then after Timothy McVeigh did what he did, it became, a national icon or whatever you want to call it, a pariah or whatever.
Well, I find it interesting too. Okay, when he released it in chapters in the book, was he using the name Andrew McDonald at the time, or he only did that for the novel? For the
He only did that for the novel. Initially, it was just a chapter, like in addition to his Attack magazine. He created it wasn't really a magazine. It was more like a newspaper. Because I remember as a child in my basement every month stuffing and sealing this fucking newspaper into envelopes and sealing these envelopes and sending them out. I hated that. I hated that so much, but my dad made me do this every single month. And I remember this
I
so
think you told a
vividly.
story. I think you told a story about how you had to have a special edition because of an individual, and I think you carve the individual or something about the individual
Carto.
into it.
Yeah, Carto.
So-
Absolutely. Yeah. I will never forget that.
Well, tell us about that, because that is a funny little interlude.
Yeah. I mean, there was this guy, Carto, who, at first they were together, and then they separated, and they kind of fought with each other about where the National Alliance was going to go. Together they were with the National Youth Alliance, and then they kind of separated. Carto had this huge mailing list of supporters, this anti whatever you want to call it, name mailing list. And my father and Carto fought over this. And I just remember as a child that my mom, because my dad never talked to me, but my mom says, we need to do this special mailing because Carto is smearing dad and dad needs to respond. And I remember scratching into the table, I hate Carto. And yeah, and I just remember every single month for several days, my brother and I would have to go down in the basement, and we had to stuff and seal these envelopes with all these magazines. They weren't really magazines, it was more like a newspaper, and we would fold them in half, put them in an envelope, and then seal the envelope, and then my dad would put a label on it, and then he would mail it out, and I hated that so much.
So as an adult, you never responded to the envelope stuffing jobs?
No, I mean, I never really I mean, I was what? I was probably 8 years old. I never really understood what was going on. But I remember when I wrote and I scratched into the table, I hate Carto. And my brother, he was my twin. He was like, look what Kelvin just did. And my dad looked at it, and I felt like he would be proud of me. But he looked at it and he just frowned. And I was like, oh my God, he's not proud of me, which happened all my life. And
Well, at
I
least he
just
didn't
can
beat you that time, right?
No, he didn't beat me,
So
but
I
I
guess it
felt
was
like
somewhere in the middle.
yeah, exactly, yeah,
Wow.
exactly.
Okay. So, did he release this as Andrew McDonald again to
No,
infect the world
no,
without his name being on it?
no, he didn't do that until he published the book, and he published that book in 1978. It was when I was a freshman in college. It was at Bridgewater College in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and the reason why I remember that is because it was the first time I was really away from home, and I was, on the track team at Bridgewater College. I threw the discus, threw the javelin and the shot put, and I had asked my mom and my father to come visit me and, watch one of my track meets. When I was in track at high school, my father never came. He never was interested in me being a football player or being a track, team member, but he decided all of a sudden that he would come to this track meet at Bridgewater College, and I was so surprised. Um, Unfortunately, he didn't show up until after the track meet was over. And then I found out later that the only reason he showed up is because Bridgewater College is, a couple of miles outside of Harrisonburg, Virginia. And it was Harrisonburg, Virginia, where he was actually getting his book, The Turner Diaries, published for the first time. And that was the only reason he was interested in being there.
Well, that's kind of a bitter little discovery later on.
Yeah, exactly.
Did
But
you
no
ever read the
surprise.
books?
I did. Yeah, I read both the Turner Diaries and Hunter. Um, I will tell you that Turner Diaries didn't surprise me too much, but Hunter had a really big impact on me. As far as I was concerned, Hunter was the most outrageous diatribe against Jewish people that I've ever read in my life. I just couldn't get over how incredibly pointed and um, hate filled. Every word in his book was about Jewish people. And, you tried to read these novels about, hey, such and such is doing this, and here's their adventures, and here's their life. And in a way, you could follow that with Turner Diaries, but Hunter was was just a massive, incredible, hate-filled diatribe against Jewish people that was almost impossible for me to read.
It was written by a man who propagates his message through mail order and radio broadcasts, and now mainstream bookstores.
Interesting. Now, I have to confess, I haven't read either book. I probably will at some point just to have the knowledge of it, but it's not something I'm necessarily eager to. Um, Terry Nichols, who is in prison right now for Oklahoma
hmm
City bombing as well, he viewed Hunter, not the Turner Diaries, Hunter as a template for Timothy McVeigh's potential coerced or manipulated relationship with the FBI. Um,
And I can totally understand that because a hunter was more of a political description and diatribe against, everything that my father saw the American government that stood for. He felt like the American government started the Vietnam War simply because of Jewish reasons. He felt like the American government started the World War II simply because of Jewish reasons. He felt like that the entire American government system was controlled by Jewish people who wanted to control everything that happened in America to make sure that money flowed into Israel to support the Jewish people. And so, there's a complete connect between Jewish people and everything that's happening in the world. Everything that's happening in the world, everything bad that's happening in the world is connected to Jews and how they control the American government and how they control the world and how they control the American media system. It's, the Turner Diaries is more of a novel. It has effects like that, but it's more like here's what happens when you have a race war. Um, Hunter is more like, here's exactly what's happening from a political standpoint.
Interesting. So, between the Hunter Diaries, I'm sorry, that was a slip. Between the
Turner
Turner
Diaries.
Diaries and Hunter, which book did your father consider to be more important and why?
Um, I mean, he considered Hunter to be more important from a political statement standpoint, but he was a realist, and after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, he realized that the Turner Diaries was, his heyday. He realized that he became from a 1,500 supporter organization to a world renowned organization. If it wasn't for Oklahoma City bombing, then the Turner Diaries and the National Alliance would have always been, kind of behind the scenes.
There's the Alfred Murray Federal Building behind me, and you can see just how badly damaged it is. It's about half of the building that is literally hanging, and at the bottom two floors are just stacked debris.
My father, worked for decades to try to create this hate organization, and he never had more than 1,000 or 1,500 supporters. And most of the supporters were in the closet. They didn't want to become public because they didn't want to jeopardize their standing in society. And then after Oklahoma City, the Turner Diaries became, infamous. And people all over the world wanted to read this book. And my dad started getting publicity all over the world, and he loved this. Um, but politically or ideologically, Hunter was his true statement about what he believed about Jews in society and our world.
Did your father know Timothy McVeigh
Yes,
before
absolutely.
the bombing?
Yes, they had conversations. It's not that my father knew what Timothy McVeigh was going to do. But they knew each other from my father being like a cult leader and Timothy McVeigh being a follower. I can't say it was any more than that.
Well, and from what I understand, Timothy McVeigh, for example, was at Waco, and one of the things he was doing is he had like a box, I believe, of the Turner Diaries. He was going gun show to gun show all over the place, and I don't know if I say prophesizing, but he was selling or giving away the Turner Diaries
No,
all
what
over.
he was doing, it was he was buying, um, massive quantities of the Turner Diaries, and he believed in it so much that he was going to gun show all over, Western America, and he was trying to sell these copies. And often he sold the copies of these books at less than what he paid for them because he believed in it so much.
Okay, so that would imply a relationship. If he's buying quantities of them, I believe your dad was
Yeah,
self-publishing at that point.
and it's no secret that right before the bombing that Timothy McVeigh tried to call my father several times, and unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, he wasn't able to actually physically connect with my father, but he called and left several messages and tried to connect with my dad. Um, but I know he and my dad knew each other, and I agreed ideologically about what was happening in the world.
Um, okay, and I know that they were saying, there was a 40-minute phone call to your father's private number in West Virginia. I don't know if you're familiar with that beforehand. Do you know anything about that or?
No, I don't. Mm-mm.
Okay. I didn't know if your father had ever acknowledged the call to you or anybody else.
He did not. After that call happened, I only spoke to my father probably one more time before he died.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. 1995 in September was the last time I met with him really in person. I met with him one more time after that when I visited his compound. Um, but yeah, I had very limited contact with him because he was so busy and he was so really um, unconcerned about, family connections. I tried. I really tried. I really wanted to have a relationship with my dad despite everything that happened and despite all of the abuse. Um, but he was just so engaged with his world and what he saw his responsibility was that he really just completely neglected his family.
That's horrible. And I mean, I need to put into it, but after the Oklahoma City bombing, how did your father view McVeigh? Did he see him as a liability, a martyr, or something more complicated?
I mean, he saw him two ways. Number one, he saw um, McVeigh as an opportunity to become more famous or recognized on the world stage. He recognized that McVeigh, you know, vaulted the Turner Diaries and my father into the world view. But from an ideological standpoint, he realized that what McVeigh did was not really successful because my father really felt like that what really needed to happen was a complete and total coordinated race war against the United States. And what he considered this was, like a one-up swipe against the government, which was completely worthless. He felt like, this is a waste of time. This is a waste of energy. And what we really need to do is we all need to get together and coordinate and have a successful war against the United States government. And if you just do a one up like this, it doesn't do anything. It just makes the public persona against you. And my father recognized that, and he wrote about it. Um, and what he really would wanted was that people like Timothy McVeigh and other people in the world to come together and coordinate and have a true successful race war against the United States government.
Now, I'm not sure if I'm getting this right because I confused some of the names and things like that, but I believe the order came into a relationship with your father? This is before Timothy McVeigh. This is going back into the early 80s.
Yeah, that
And
was Robert
ultimately,
Matthews. Yeah.
right, correct. Robert Matthews, ultimately the murder of Alan Berg, the disc jockey out of Denver
Yes.
or Boulder or something like that. And apparently the question was asked of Jim Ellison, and Jim Ellison was with the CSA, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. I think is what they call themselves, not the Confederate States of America, but I'm sure they meant for the tie-in to be there. It was asked by J.D. Cash, a reporter covering the Oklahoma City bombing of Jim Ellison, did the order exist still, and was it around? And because it was obviously influenced by the Turner Diaries, there was the order. And he said that William Luther Pierce would know of them and was the man who had contact with any remnants of the order out there. Can you confirm this, or do you know?
I mean, as far as I know, the order was basically Robert Matthews and the people who decided to follow him.
Mhm.
And so once Robert Matthews was killed by the FBI in Whidbey Island, it's an island off of Seattle, Washington, the order pretty much ceased to exist after that.
When Timothy McVeigh went on trial earlier this year, the prosecution relied heavily on evidence that showed his anti-government sentiments. He studied and appears to have used as a blueprint for the Oklahoma City bombing an extremist book called the Turner Diaries. And he reportedly analyzed the activities of a white separatist group operating in the 1980s called the Order.
The gist of it was that we were starting an order here.
To do what?
Basically, to bring down the government, to start chaos, to disrupt the system in the best way we could.
You absolutely believe?
We absolutely believed it.
So many of my father's supporters were people who would send him money, would attend his meetings, but they were never willing to stick their necks out. But my father truly admired Robert Matthews because Robert Matthews was willing to do whatever it took, as far as he was concerned, or my father was concerned, to save the white race. And so Robert Matthews was willing to, rob banks and armored cars and to gather money and to try to finance this revolution to overthrow the government and to create a whites-only homeland in America. Of course, that's ridiculous when you think about the overall scheme of things. How can this entirely puny group fight against the U.S. government? But that's what Robert Matthews was willing to do, and that's what my father truly admired. And, Robert Matthews was a keynote speaker at one of my father's National Alliance conferences. My father had truly admired this man because he was willing to do what my father was not willing to do. My father wanted to do these things, but he wasn't willing to put his neck out on the line because my father was definitely afraid of ending up in a jail. Um, he told me when I was young that I don't want to end up in a DC jail with all these black people, and you know what they're going to do to me if I end up in jail. That was one of my father's biggest fears, was like, what will happen to me if I end up in jail? All these black people are going to kill me.
So there was a touch of hypocrisy there. That your dad was very critical of those who would send money but didn't want their face or name on anything. But he himself had a limit to skin in the game. Is that fair?
That's fair. Totally. He was willing to write. He was willing to hide behind his pen, but he wasn't willing to put his actual neck out on the line.
Okay, now I'm going to throw another name out there. I don't know that there is an association out there, but Gordon Call. Was there any relationship between your dad and Gordon Call, or any crossover that you know of?
I can't speak to that. I don't recognize that name.
Okay, and I think Arthur Kirk.
Huh?
Arthur Kirk.
Nope. Sorry.
Nope.
Don't recognize that name either.
No problem. No problem. Did your father maintain a private map of individuals and cells beyond the public National Alliance membership?
I mean, he maintained a map of organization all over the world, including Europe. He had a very close relationship with organizations in Europe. He actually went to Germany on one point to speak at a conference. And it became evident at this conference that if he went to the podium to speak, that he would be arrested. And he decided not to do that because, again, my dad, when it came to really putting his neck out, was a coward. Um, and he was also connected very strongly with white supremacist organizations in the UK. So yeah, he was known all over Europe and the UK, and very connected with them. Um, but I can't tell you specific names.
Okay. Well, along that line, and because I'm learning this as it goes along, I spoke with somebody who was actually a skinhead on the phone, and he described it as a movement, and I was like, okay. And so I'm going to use that term here for
Okay.
a lot of loosely aligned or similarly minded organizations that all were directionally traveling the same, I guess.
Okay.
How interconnected was the National Alliance with, say, Aryan nations, CSA, Elohim City itself, and remnants of the order in reality?
I mean, they were pretty well connected. But toward the end, before my father passed away, um, he became disillusioned with a lot of these organizations, especially in the United States. He felt like they were more like redneck or organizations that truly weren't serious about the political movement as he saw it, about truly trying to save the white race. He felt like they were more like, you know, redneck organizations that were more like, we'll hate you and we'll fight you and we'll do this, but we won't truly get politically involved to, um, be part of the white revolution against the United States government. Um, and he actually wrote about it. And one of the last things that he wrote before he passed away was a diatribe against a lot of these groups that were supposedly aligned with the National Alliance. And he was like, these groups are a waste of time and they're not serious. And it was one of the main reasons why, after he passed away, that the National Alliance faded away and eventually failed, is because he wrote this. And a lot of these groups were like so disillusioned by what he said, they basically washed their hands of my dad and his group,
Okay.
because he felt like they weren't serious enough. He felt like they weren't serious enough to politically be involved to actually create a race war against the United States government.
For which I think we're all, a lot of us are thankful. But anyway, your book describes extensive FBI attention. And how frequently was your father in contact, directly or indirectly with the federal authorities?
Directly, very minimally. Indirectly, a lot. I mean, I remember as a teenager, um, when I was a student at Virginia Tech, and I was back home for the summer, and I was sleeping at the family home. There were a couple of times I specifically remember waking up to a call at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning from the FBI, and they were like, "This is the FBI. Do you know where your father is?" And I'm like, completely disoriented and have no idea what's going on. And finally, when I realized what's going on, I'm like, no, I have no idea. And they're like, well, we're trying to figure out where your father is, and we haven't been able to reach figure out where he was in the last 2 days, and you need to tell us where he is. And I'm like, what the fuck? And that happened several times. Um, my father absolutely had no personal contact with them. Um, he was afraid all the time of being arrested. He was afraid all the time of being put in jail. His biggest fear was, the sedition laws, that his writing of the Turner Diaries and his writing of the Attack magazine, that it would be considered more than free speech or considered more than a novel, and that he considered the Jewish influence would um, charge him with sedition. And he really was afraid that he would end up in jail one day.
Well, okay, speaking of sedition, because there was very famously sedition trials in the 1980s, and um, one of the lawyers who worked on that is Kirk Lyons. Do you know if there was
Mhm.
a relationship there with your father and Kirk?
Absolutely. And my father was there, to support behind the scenes. And my father was also like, what's going to happen here is something that might happen in my future. And, the fact that those laws and those trials eventually were not successful, was something that my father was, he paid very close attention to that. But I will tell you, every single day of my father's life after he wrote the Turner Diaries and he was writing the Attack magazine, he was concerned. He was absolutely convinced that eventually that the Jewish influence in the government was going to come get him and put him in jail.
And ironically, that same fear probably helped him die, correct? Because he refused to get medical attention because of Jewish influence in the medical world.
Yeah. I mean, when he established his compound in West Virginia, he was afraid that Jewish people were sneaking onto the compound and poisoning his well. When he became sick with cancer, he was absolutely convinced that all the doctors were Jews and that they were trying to kill him. And so he wasn't willing to accept their advice. He wasn't willing to accept any true medical intervention because he truly felt like the whole world was a Jewish scheme against him.
Now, on that note, now, towards the end of his life, he kind of imported. I want to say imported. I don't know what the right term would be. A new wife from Germany and another female from Germany. Was this a polyamorous type of relationship? What was going on with
No,
your
no, what
father?
he did was he went on a magazine. It was called Washingtonian Magazine. It was kind of like what we would call today a dating website, but it was before dating websites were mainstream on the internet. It was kind of like an advertisement, like, hey, I'm an American. I'm looking for a wife. I'm looking for companionship. I think the first one was from Hungary, not from Germany. Um, and he had several of these. After he divorced my mother, I think he had 4 or 5 of these before he passed away. And these were immigrants from Hungary and Germany and Austria who were young women that were looking for an opportunity to get out of poverty and to come to America. But they had no idea what they were getting into. They had no idea that my father was such a narcissist and such a focused individual that only cared about his work and didn't give a damn about his relationship or about other people. I met some of these women and they were basically very clear about how, your father is 100% National Alliance, doesn't give a shit about me, doesn't care about me, and I'm here all alone, all by myself, and I will do everything I can to get out of this life and start over.
Wow.
Yeah.
Back to the FBI a little bit. How because your father was so afraid of being locked up and whatnot, I'm sure he had concerns about informants. And with that, how did he view informants? Did he view them as inevitable? Did he view them as tools to, manipulate to get a message through? And
I mean, when it came to the Turner Diaries, he spoke to a friend of his, and he told his friend, like, I'm so frustrated. I've been writing this attack magazine for years and years and years, and I just can't get any traction. I can't get any more than like 1,000 supporters throughout the entire United States, and this is just not enough to sustain me. And this supporter basically said, you know what? You need to write to their level. These are basically, middle or uneducated, nervous, people who are, um, they have a grievance against the world. These are people who really don't have anything in their future. They just, they have problems because of their families or for their father or their mother, but they're nursing a grievance against the world, and you need to speak to them. And the only way you can do that is to write to their level. And so my father was like, okay, so I'll write at a really basic level and I'll write about violence. And so that's when he started writing about the Turner Diaries. And he wrote one chapter in each issue of Attack magazine, and it became wildly popular. And that's when he decided, oh, okay, I'm going to put this into a book. But yeah, at the beginning, he had no idea he was going to write a book. At the beginning, his only ideal was, I just want to reach people. I want people to respond to me. I want to try to get more people to donate and say that they're willing to support my cause.
Okay, now I was also asking about informants within the organization, like FBI informants and things like that. Was he worried about it, and how did he, if he was, how did he go about identifying them? Because there are a lot of informants in that particular world.
I mean, he was certainly worried about it, but I don't know how he went about identifying them. But I know that from my mother, not from him, because my father and I never really spoke when it came to stuff like that, but my mother and I did. I know that my mom told me that he was afraid all the time. Um, and we had FBI raids at our house, where for some reason my dad was always aware before that happened and he was prepared.
Hmm.
But that happened, and I know that one of his biggest fears in life was that he was gonna end up in the DC, what he called the DC jail, because he considered the DC jail to be full of black people, and he considered that to be the worst experience of his life because, he spent his whole life railing against black people and how they
Sure.
were destroying the white race, and so his biggest concern was, "I'm gonna end up in the DC jail and they're gonna kill me."
Yeah, like a cop going to prison's got something to worry
Exactly,
about.
yeah. Yeah.
Sure. Um, you bring up an interesting point when you said somehow he seemed to know. I'm gonna throw this out there. I don't know if anybody's asked you. Is it possible your father was an FBI informant?
I don't know. Eric, I really don't know. I can just tell you that the most um, influential experience in my life when it comes to that is that my father, um, he dealt with and um, he stored chemicals and explosives in our house. And I remember when he and I, when I was a child, made nitroglycerin in our dining room. And I remember when he and I, as a child, made a bomb and we exploded that bomb in our backyard. Um, but I also remember when the FBI actually came and raided our house, in our crawl spaces where my dad kept all that stuff. But by the time the FBI came and raided our house, all that stuff was gone. And I can't tell you how that happened. I just know that when it actually happened, that my dad was prepared and all that stuff was gone.
Hmm. Now I'm pivoting back to Timothy McVeigh. Are you aware of, or do you know about the correspondence between him and the McVeigh defense team, specifically Stephen Jones?
Yeah, I'm aware that my dad helped with the defense team. I'm also aware that right before the bombing actually happened, that Timothy McVeigh tried to call my dad several times, but he was not able to actually connect with my dad. Beyond that, I don't know anything.
Okay. I'm gonna put out some other names, three other names. I'm just curious if you've ever met them or you've heard any discussion of them, etc. Richard Kaufman,
No,
the Isaacson brothers,
no,
and Reverend Jack Oliphant.
nope. Sorry.
Okay. No problem. Well, again, and just so everybody understands, you were not exactly hanging out in the organization working with your dad at the time. You just happened to have a dad who did that. Would that be fair to say?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's fair. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, after I left home in 1982 to go to Virginia Tech and start my university studies, I only had a couple of contacts with my father after that. I saw him, when he came to my graduation in 1983. I saw him when I introduced him to my fiance shortly after that. And then he came and visited me once in my home after I got married. And then one time after that, I went to visit him at his compound. And that was pretty much it. I tried a lot to try to establish a father-son relationship with him, and you know what? After I left home, he was more amenable to that. He was more like, yeah, I'm interested in you and tell me what's happening in your life. But it was only on a one-on-one basis. And after I left and I was out of his immediate view, I was gone. And so it was very short term.
and your brother's even less close, from what I understand.
My brother was 100% less. My brother never had anything to do with him after he left the home. He never tried to establish contact with him, except he told my dad that he had uh, my dad had a grandson and a granddaughter, and my dad never responded. And my brother decided that, if you're not even going to respond that you have a granddaughter and a grandson, then fuck you. I wash my hands of you. And my brother was like, that's it. I'm done. I will never care about this man again. And that was the end of it. And after my father died and I decided I wanted to go to his memorial service to get some closure, I contacted my brother and said, hey, let's go and let's get some closure. And he's like, fuck that. I don't give a shit. I don't care. He never ever acknowledged that I have a son or a daughter, and I don't care.
And that's fair enough.
Yeah, totally
That's his
understand
own
that.
closure. He closed the door. Um,
Exactly.
I want to go back to 95 because that's hanging over. And how did that affect you when you heard of that incident? You had to have started to hear the Turner Diaries and whatever else. Can you tell me about that? How did it affect you? What happened with you?
I mean, it affected me in a couple of different ways. I mean, number one was like, oh my God. Number two was, I spent my whole young adult life um, avoiding my father, avoiding any connection with my dad, not telling any of my college friends or anybody at the university who I was or who I was related to. Um, but there was this secret part of me that was like, oh my God, my dad's famous. Oh my God, I'm famous because my dad is famous. And it was kind of like a feeling of infamy. I can't really describe what it was, but it was a feeling of, oh my God, this is really important. And it wasn't until years later when I started getting, really good friends, because it took me a long time to overcome all of the abuse, um, to really start allowing myself to be open enough to become friends with other people, that I started sharing my experiences with them and saying, hey, this is who my dad was and this is how it was like. That's the first time I really realized that, this is really important and this is an important story, and I really should start telling this story to people.
Did this influence your choices later in life? I understand you work with, I believe, a ministry, and you're trying to help children, I believe from Georgia, and maybe other areas, find families, be adopted. Can you talk about that? And did this come out of this? Like kind of trying to make up for things in the world?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, probably the most influential part of this whole thing is that I was so, or I felt so damaged as a human being when I left home based on the abuse from my father. Because, my father was incredibly abusive. And, he was abusive because he was so damaged himself that, um, he couldn't healthily be a father to anybody. And so when I, as a human being, interacted with him, he didn't know how to deal with that except to abuse me. And so, I grew up believing that I was completely um, unworthy. I believed that I was unworthy of love. I believed that I was not a worthy human being because of the way my father treated me all my life. And so when I decided as a human being and as an adult to try to create a family, I decided that I did not want to procreate my genes because I was so afraid that
Yeah.
my genes would be um, part of my father. And I believe that if I became a father of my own children, that I would be like my father and that I would be abusive. And it scared the shit out of me. And so when my wife said, hey, you know what? I've always dreamed as a child of being adopting child. I was like, yeah, let's do that. And then I don't have to worry about creating children that are so fucked up like I am, that maybe I can adopt children that aren't fucked up and have the same genes that I have and my father has. And that's what led to my life journey of being a father of adopted children, because I was scared to death of, basically procreating my genes, of being a reflection of who my father was. It was just like, I can't do this.
Did you ever discuss that with your brother?
Yeah, absolutely. And my brother has absolutely a different opinion because you know what? When I grew up, my brother was a twin,
Mhm.
but in a way, because he was born 5 minutes younger than me, he was the younger twin, and he kind of flew under the radar. But I was always on the top, and my father always focused on me. So all the abuse,
Mm.
90% of it was focused on me.
I see.
Because for some reason, because my brother was younger and smaller, my father felt like I was the one that would be, you know, his mini me. And so my
Tallest
father
poppy
always
gets tallest
ex-
poppy gets cut first.
exactly, yeah. And so, my brother, he has a son and a daughter, and they're amazing. And he never once felt like that was a problem, and he never once had any issues raising them as a wonderful father. Um, but that's me. That's my
Sure,
mental trash.
sure. Okay, I always try to ask a final question when closing, and it could be one of two variants because some people, when I spring it, they're like, "Oh, geez, I don't know." And it's essentially, what is the one question I should have asked you, but I neglected to? Or as an alternative, what is one question after, all these years, different interviews, things you have done that you've been waiting for somebody to ask you? and they have not.
Mm. Well, I guess the question would be, given everything that you've experienced in your life, um, what can you do to overcome that?
That's a great question.
And for me, um, it's all about your thoughts. So when I grew up and in my young adulthood, I had all these really awful feeling thoughts, all of these fearful thoughts that would run through my mind. I would have all these feelings of unworthiness. I would have these feelings of like, oh my God, I'm going to fail. I would have all these thoughts of, I'm not good enough. Um, but through my work with counselors and through self-reflection, I've realized that you have the ability to choose your thoughts. You have the ability to say, you know what, these awful feeling thoughts, I can let them go. I can let them go like clouds floating in the sky. And I can choose the good feeling thoughts. I can choose the thoughts that say, hey, you know what, Kelvin, you are good enough. You know what, Kelvin, you are worthy. And you know what, you can do good things in this life. And that feels better than the thoughts that say, you know what, you're worthless. All the thoughts that my father instilled into me. And that's the question is, do you really want to examine your thoughts? And do you really want to take power over the thoughts that you can choose? And you know what? You have the ability in life. Everybody has this ability to choose the good feeling thoughts and let the bad feeling thoughts go away.
I think it's a good philosophy. What you describe of your father makes me think of the old saying that hate is like swallowing poison and waiting for the other person to die.
That,
Yeah.
yeah, that's very accurate indeed. Hate, hating other is pretty much the same as hating yourself. If you truly love yourself, you can't hate other people.
Very true. Now, Kelvin is the author of Sins of My Father, Growing Up with America's Most Dangerous White Supremacists. There is a link in the description, and there's even an audiobook. So thank you for doing that, by the way, as an audiobook, because a lot of my audience, including myself, that's how I'm consuming it, is the audiobook. But thank you so much, Kelvin. I deeply appreciate it.
My pleasure, Eric. It was a really good time meeting with you and speaking with you.